MoGraph is a huge advancement in the creation of moving graphics. Now that might sound like marketing hype, but it's not, because MoGraph really has transformed the way that motion graphics artists create forms in motion. So that begs the question, what is MoGraph? Well, officially, MoGraph is a procedural modeling and animation module for Cinema 4D. But what it really is a collection of objects, shaders, and scripts that can be combined in a nearly infinite number of ways to create animation and shapes that simply weren't possible before, unless you had access to an army of programmers. So what I've got here is a very simple scene. I'm going to hit Command or Control R on the keyboard to render this out. And it's just a set of vines. Now, these vines actually animate over time, and I created these with MoGraph. I'm going to adjust the time slider here and back up in time. You'll see these guys grow out of the ground and towards the camera. And it's a really, really simple setup. MoGraph at its heart is a collection of objects, and those objects are generators and operators. If you remember from earlier chapters, generators work with children or multiple children to generate some sort of result. Operators work on their parent or their peer. There's also a new class of object that came with MoGraph called the effector, which modifies generators. In this scene, I've got a very simple cloner object that is cloning a series of vines, and those vines are created using MoGraph as well. You can see there's a cloner. I'm going to disable the initial cloner here that is creating the multiple vines, and then I'm going to disable the spline wrap object that's making this spline go onto the vine itself. So if I disable that, I end up with this straight tube here. The way I created this vine was by creating a very simple leaf setup, and there's a single leaf right there. I'll click off this cloner, and you can see in the center of the world here, I've got a very simple leaf shape that's embedded in my initial vine, and I duplicated that leaf with this cloner object, and that cloner object is part of MoGraph. When I turn on the cloner, it creates copies of that leaf, and those copies can now be manipulated further. So what I did was I took the copies of the leaf and the cylinder that represents the vine, and I used a deformer called the spline wrap object to deform those guys onto a spline. And I'll back out a little bit. You can see this is another copy of that spline, but when I turn the spline wrap on, those clones along with that cylinder end up moving onto that spline. And the beautiful part about MoGraph is that it's all still live. If I want to make more leaves, I can go to this cloner that's creating those leaves, and I can crank up the count. I can go to the count property and say, I want more leaves on my object. I can crank up the size of those objects as well. I can scale them up and make them 5 times bigger. So there's a lot of control that you get and flexibility that you get with MoGraph that simply wasn't possible before. You're probably thinking to yourself, why the heck is this chapter so short? Well, the blessing and curse of MoGraph is just how deep the module is. I always tell my students we could do an entire semester just on MoGraph. That goes way beyond Essential Training. Even though this is one of the longer chapters in the Essential Training series, it's really incredibly short compared to how deep MoGraph is. The blessing and curse of MoGraph is just how deep the module is. So my goal for this chapter is to introduce you to what I think are the most important things to know about the package that'll help you get started using it.